She hated men so much that she wanted to do in the ones that she came in contact with.
These are the stories of terrible deeds.
There were the kings and queens. They decided about life and death.
Of crimes written in blood on history's pages.
The court decided that she was sane and she could have been the person next door.
She had a death wish. She'd killed the only thing she ever loved and she wanted to die.
Across time and across continents, something united these murderers.
Some women believe that they are entitled to kill a man who cheats on them.
They were driven by the emotion of the ages.
They say about 45 to 60 minutes it took the patients to die.
The darkest force of all.
It was hard for me to say, well, how could any human do that to any other human?
For these deadly women, it was time for revenge.
She was madly in love with him, desperately in love with him, and he wasn't with her.
Police Detective Sergeant Bob Wells tries to forget the day he discovered one of Australia's most shocking crimes.
You just sort of have lost the majority of your senses for a short period of time until you actually regathered them and realised that it was reality and not a horror scene.
Daily swims are an attempt to wash away the images still lurking in his subconscious.
Clothing, cutlery, meat. It's something I'm still trying to come to grips with even today, emotionally and mentally.
Bob Wells would be just one of the lives forever changed by the deeds of Katherine Knight.
I think most of us expect somebody who's done what Katherine's done to have horns growing out of her head or to be restrained like Hannibal Lecter. But she was a very ordinary-looking woman.
Another to be affected would be journalist and author Peter Lawler, assigned to a story his newspaper couldn't publish.
Editors make a decision whether a story is palatable for people to read with their breakfast in the morning, and there was a decision made that this one wasn't palatable. It couldn't be reported. It was too horrific.
But like many, Katherine drew him in.
I wanted to know that a person who could do what Katherine Knight did was insane or not sentient. But the court decided that she was sane and she could have been the person next door.
Katherine Knight seemed to live on the edge.
She had a wild temper. She had too many boyfriends, too many fathers for the children. She came from a wild family.
By her early 40s, Katherine had experienced 4 rocky relationships. Each time, she was asked to leave. But each time, she found her way back.
She knew how to keep a bloke happy. She put up their mates drinking in the shed. She had dinner ready when they got home. Generally, she knew how to keep a bloke, and she was manipulative like that.
I think she was a very hard woman, very strong physically. I think she probably emotionally very vulnerable.
Her fiancé, John Price, was the type of man Katherine sought out.
She was a tough country girl, and they were tough country blokes. They loved to drink, they liked their knees up on a Saturday night.
But all too soon, each partner discovered Katherine's secret. An illness called borderline personality disorder.
Borderline personality disorder is kind of a catch-all term for a condition that manifests itself, the individual, and it's usually women, it can be men, very moody, tremendous mood swings.
Former FBI criminal profiler Candace DeLong says sufferers can turn quickly from lovers to fighters.
They feel slighted when there was no slight. They are prone to being very suspicious that their partner is cheating on them. Everything reflects back to somebody is taking advantage of me, and I must do something about it.
John Price usually weathered the stormy Katherine, knowing the loving Katherine would soon return. Then one day, his partner went over the line, threatening his job at the coal mine with a home video.
She'd filmed the contents of his garden shed, and in Pricey's garden shed was a first aid kit from the mine, which he'd allegedly stolen.
The pair had argued over money. Katherine wanted revenge. She sent the video to the mine boss, suggesting John was a thief.
The most important thing in most men's lives is their job. And that is the one area that the woman may feel if she can mess this up for him, all the better.
John was fired.
He threw her out of the house, said he'd never have her back. Unfortunately, he had her back within 6 months because Katherine turned on the sweet, loving side again and got back in there somehow.
And I think that there was more so a physical attraction towards her than anything else.
One man knew what John Price was going through.
Well, her mother said to me, just after we first got married, she said, "You want to watch this one? If you do the wrong thing by, she will kill you."
Katherine's first husband, David Kellett.
And I brushed it off as just one of those things that mothers say, and it didn't really dawn on me that, but one day she would go over the edge.
In late 1999, David and John met to compare notes.
I knew John Price, and he said to me he wants to get out of a relationship, but he's scared to get out. And I said, well, these days you can take all these domestic violence orders against each other, whatever. And he was just so scared, he was almost shaking. He was really scared.
Little did either man know, Katherine would soon commit one of Australia's most shocking crimes.
We don't have a lot of women on death row, but that's where she is, and she holds Bible studies, Bible sessions within death row.
In 1990, journalist Martha Quillen found the story of her career in North Carolina.
People thought she was such a fine person, and how could she have done this? And yet, the reality of what she had done was so brutal and so cruel that people were just fascinated in this dual personality in this one woman.
To the world, Blanche Taylor Moore was a caring Christian, a compassionate woman, led by spiritual commitment. So when her boyfriend Raymond Reed was hospitalized, no one was surprised at Blanche's constant care.
She was sort of beloved, I think, on the floor where he stayed, and the nurses testified that they thought she was a wonderful person and very caring, and that, Raymond was very lucky to have someone like that come in to see him.
Raymond was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Guillain-Barré syndrome is also known as French polio. It is an autoimmune disorder. The symptoms are muscle weakness, nerve tingling, progressive fatigue, and eventually may even lead to difficulty breathing.
Despite the best care, Raymond was destined to die. Again and again.
He actually died and was revived. His heart failed and he had kidney failure and died, and they revived him.
Several times, Raymond died a clinical death, losing heartbeat and respiration. But each time, expert medical staff pulled him back from the brink. Each time, Blanche was waiting with more comfort.
Apparently she took great care in preparing this food because hospital food was just not good enough for the man that she loved.
But whenever Raymond regained strength, there was another relapse.
Think of the worst flu you've ever had, multiply it by 100, and then lengthen it by 2 or 3 hours.
And another resuscitation. A terrifying roller coaster of life and death.
He's confused and frightened and, thinking he's going to die, and then he begins to get better, and then he starts to die again. And they say it's a horrible death. It's a really horrible way to die.
Raymond Reed died the final time in October 1986.
In my experience of writing about murders and covering murder trials, I think they all think that they're smarter than everybody else, and they're not going to be caught.
Within 2 years, Blanche had moved on into the arms of Reverend Dwight Moore.
He was a minister who courted her and pursued her, and she finally married him.
It seemed a match made in heaven. But during the honeymoon, the Reverend fell deathly ill. Although the symptoms mimicked Guillain-Barré syndrome, the speed of onset raised suspicions.
He happened to end up in a hospital where they had the smarts to test him for arsenic poisoning. And when they found huge doses of arsenic in his system, they immediately suspected that she had given it to him.
Reverend Moore's constitution foiled Blanche's plan. Against the odds, he survived.
Investigators later said that he had survived the largest dose of arsenic any human was ever known to have survived. So she was just unlucky. She poisoned someone whose system was stronger than she was.
Blanche would be charged with assault, and police probed further, exhuming the body of Raymond Reed. The chief medical examiner in North Carolina, John Butts, MD, exposed one of the state's most audacious murders.
This is graphing of the quantities of arsenic that were found in Mr. Reed's hair, and this tells us that that initial illness was a result of arsenic poisoning, but also tells us that he continued to receive arsenic while he was in the hospital.
Blanche was arrested and charged with murder. During her trial, jurors heard how Blanche killed her victim with kindness.
All evidence indicates that she was bringing poison to the hospital disguised with or contained within some of the food that she fed him, and continued to poison him in the hospital until ultimately he died.
During her sentencing phase, the state actually argued that his murder should be viewed as a serial murder because she killed him over and over again.
And there were more suspicions.
At one point, it looked like they were going to dig up everybody in about 3 counties and test them for arsenic. Anybody that had known Blanche Taylor Moore at any time in their lives was going to be tested.
We exhumed 5 individuals. They were individuals who it was believed that Mrs. Moore had some connection with, obviously, they were deceased individuals, and there were symptoms or circumstances surrounding the death that raised the possibility of arsenic poisoning.
Traces of arsenic were found in the bodies of Blanche's first husband and her father. Although cleared of involvement with her father's death, some believe their troubled relationship set a young Blanche on a course of revenge.
We know that he was a womanizer. We know that he left the family. I think she replicated that sort of tortured relationship with the other men that she became involved with during her life.
It is not unusual that when they grow up, the problems that they had with their father, psychologically and emotionally, will spill over into their current relationships with men. They may love their husband, but as soon as things turn south or they are made angry by him, he may represent bad daddy, and he will be the target of their wrath. She may kill her father over and over and over again.
Convicted of one murder count and charged with another, Blanche Taylor Moore awaits execution on death row.
Some women believe that they are actually entitled to kill a man who cheats on them or is leaving them for another woman. This idea is frequently reinforced in writings and stories and movies and, goodness, hundreds of years back, that this was something that women were simply entitled to do.
London, 1955. And a pretty club hostess, Ruth Ellis, had no idea she was about to divide a nation and make British legal history.
Good time girl. At 19, she's running a club in the West End of London, getting people to, buy drinks at extortionate prices. And she would con people into parting with a lot of money here in the club.
Ex-policeman John Ross oversees Scotland Yard's Crime Museum, where Ruth Ellis is remembered.
We collect items from famous cases and display them in the museum. The stories that go with all these cases, you learn from history. Nothing ever changes.
Moonlight and kisses, peaches and cream.
Many men fell under Ruth's spell, but only one would dominate her attention: the dashing David Blakey.
Self-centered, racing car driver, never actually going to make it, but spent all his life. Rich boy, just running around, enjoying himself. She was madly in love with him, desperately in love with him, and he wasn't with her.
But after a 2-year relationship, the suave race car driver was proving hard to tie down.
He'd go off and have affairs with other women all the time. Purely self-centered, selfish man, a playboy.
Each dalliance delivered more frustration for Ruth. David's philandering didn't seem to slow down. When Ruth became pregnant with his baby, things only became worse.
He punched her in the stomach. Whether that was to get rid of the baby or it was just in one of their violent moments, you will never know. But all he did was send her a bunch of flowers the next day and said sorry. That was it. Yeah.
Ruth lost her baby and planned her revenge.
Women are much more relationship-based. They are much more into their feelings and their intuition. I feel that when women's relationships are disrupted, they can become furious.
A gun is an interesting weapon because it allows the shooter, the killer, to dispatch their victim without even getting close to them. It's all going to be over in a matter of minutes.
This is a small caliber revolver. This is classified as a low velocity handgun. In other words, the speed at which the bullet would be leaving the end of the muzzle would be less than 2,000 feet per second.
On April 10, 1955, David Blakey was drinking in the Magdala pub in North London. Ruth and her weapon were ready.
The reason this is such an effective weapon is that it doesn't take much force at all to pull the trigger. In fact, probably 2 to 3, maybe 4 pounds of pressure.
As they came out of the pub, Ruth Ellis stepped out the shadows and called his name.
David!
Fired 2 shots at him.
When a bullet enters that body, the kinetic energy will cause a cavity, something called a temporary cavity, that's caused by energy radiating out from that speeding bullet.
He just walked up and emptied the other 3 bullets into him.
When a bullet enters a body, it perforates through the skin. As it does so, it will damage blood vessels and it will cause massive internal bleeding. Blood will accumulate and the body will go into shock when it has lost approximately 20% of its circulating blood volume.
It was a very public murder. Many witnesses. In 1955, murder was a capital offense.
The problem for Ruth Ellis was she had a death wish. She'd killed the only thing she ever loved and she wanted to die.
Facing a death sentence, Ruth offered no resistance at her trial.
You know, she was actually admitted when asked about firing the bullets into David Blakey. She said, yeah, of course I went there. I went to the Magdala Public House that evening with the intention of shooting David Blakey and killing him. Now, she's admitted the premeditation, she's admitted the act. She has to be found guilty, she has to be found guilty of murder.
Although many believed Ruth was driven to murder by her victim's actions, English law at the time could make no concession.
It's difficult to imagine a civilized society putting to death a killer who had a clear-cut history of abuse from the individual that they killed.
Modern laws recognizing diminished responsibility were yet to be written. Despite public protests and parliamentary petitions, 28-year-old Ruth Ellis was hanged at Holloway Prison. It would be a turning point in English justice. New laws recognizing battered woman syndrome and diminished responsibility would follow. Within 10 years, capital punishment was suspended. Ruth would be the last woman executed in England. In an undisclosed Australian city, David Kellett lives in hiding. Although he left his ex-wife many years ago, recent events make him fear for his life. his former spouse, is Katherine Knight.
You can't change a psychopath, and I believe in my own heart she's a psychopathic killer and she'll never change.
In a small Australian town, Katherine and David, her first love, planned a life together.
To start with, she's the most wonderful woman I think you could wish for. So devoted, perfect mother, perfect housewife.
But Katherine's borderline personality disorder was never far from the surface.
She could snap just like a biscuit. It wouldn't take much to set her off. The slightest thing, if she made a cup of coffee and there's no water in the jug, just something as simple as that.
One night, a darts competition almost ended David's life.
One of the elements of borderline personality disorder is that you cannot stand abandonment. And that means if somebody says they're going to be home at 10 o'clock, you want them home at 10 o'clock. And by 10:05, you're in a rage. By 10:10, you're in a murderous rage.
And she rang about, I think about 10 o'clock and said, the pub's closed, come on home. And I said, well, the dart competition hasn't quite finished yet, I'll be home when I'm ready.
There was an insult to the core. When he said, I'll be home from the pub shortly, she took that as the same as being stabbed in the heart, as total rejection. And the way to make herself feel better is to exact revenge.
When somebody's getting stressed, it's usually a reaction that comes down to fear. Fear causes the release of adrenaline or epinephrine. So the heart would start beating more rapidly. Somebody would start breathing more quickly. There would be that fight or flight reaction.
David Kellett was coming home to a biochemical maelstrom.
She'd hit me so hard on the back of the head that my eyes went black. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital. Spent all my clothes in the bathtub, everything I owned, every bit of clothing she'd burnt in the bathtub.
And when the fury subsided, the caring Katherine returned.
A couple of days later, after being released from hospital, she went and bought me all brand new clothes. It was just like the type of person she was.
But there was something more frightening than Katherine's moods. A slaughterhouse worker, she brought her tools home to hang above the marital bed.
The knives were hanging on the wall. I put a special hook there so she could hang the knives, and no one touched the knives. Her knives were the most treasured item that God ever gave to her.
We are drawn to certain jobs, hobbies, vocations, avocations, because of inner needs. My guess is that she was drawn to work in a profession that allowed her to have access and use of knives on a daily basis because that was something that she found interesting, something that met some deep-seated need.
She was just totally and absolutely possessed by knives. They were her life.
Katherine's obsession had a name.
Picarism, which is a clinical term, someone that is aroused or finds pleasure in the idea of cutting, slicing, and stabbing skin. The image in the individual's mind of the knife piercing skin is pleasant for them or even arousing.
Katherine's fascination with blades and her violent moods were on a collision course. The warning signs were enough for David Kellett. He left Katherine after 10 years. John Price wouldn't be so lucky. a killer's troubling behavior can alert potential victims. But for some unfortunate citizens of Vienna, Austria, there were no such clues. The motivation was obscure, the location unusual, the perpetrators unexpected.
This was a shock around the world, what really happened here in Vienna.
Max Edelbacher heads criminal investigations in Vienna's South District. In 1989, he and his team were called to the Lyons General Hospital.
This is one of the largest hospitals, especially dealing with very elder people.
In the preceding 3 years, an alarming number of elderly patients were dying in just one wing, Pavilion 5. Investigators soon found out why.
It's so terrible because you never would expect in a hospital that this is a murder station. No?
Angels of death. Nurses who kill patients. Usually act alone and never tell anyone. Not so in this case.
Angels of death are often motivated by sympathy for their victims or a lust for attention. In Pavilion 5, the motivation was very different.
There was a lot of stress, a lot of overworked for these nurses. And in this time, in 88 and 89, more than 60 to 65 people were in one room. And in the night shift, only 2 nurses could care for these people.
Nicht schon wieder.
Elderly patients were demanding. Too demanding.
They have an alarm next to their bed, and they were using this alarm each 5 or 10 minutes.
For one group of nurses, the solution was eternal silence.
And they became angry, and then they started to select such persons who were really active in calling them.
Ringleader Gertrude Wagner and 3 others had a pact made even crueler by their methods. In Vienna, Austria, forensic scientist Professor Johann Mislewitz would uncover one of his country's worst serial murders and the unusual murder weapon, water.
A little push was sufficient to put them to test to obstruct the breathing mechanism.
The nurses were drowning their patients.
Well, they brought the victim into a comfortable position for them. They pressed the tank down with a spatula and poured the water into the airways.
Drowning is a form of asphyxia. There will be an initial shock and an attempt to hold one's breath. When they can no longer hold it, they're going to exhale that breath and inhale water. That is going to be incredibly uncomfortable.
They say about 45 to 60 minutes it took the patients to die. They started to groan, they flattened their breathing, they became pale gray, and after about an hour they were dead.
The technique should have defied suspicion. Many patients already suffered from pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs.
That was assumed by them that they could get away with it because you can't distinguish between liquid from pulmonary edema and liquid from tap water.
For almost 3 years, they did get away with it, and with other methods, overdoses of insulin and sedatives.
Then they became like sisters of death, and they became more and more safe in their relationship because nothing happened. There were the kings and queens. They decided about life and death.
Although the nurses would cite their motivation as frustration, the scale and daring suggests another factor to criminal profiler Candace DeLong.
I think what it has to do is the risk. Can I do this horrible thing? Can I cross this line society says if I cross, it's all over for me, right in front of other people and get away with it? And that thrill, that extra risk, is why they do it.
The killing might have continued had the nurses not been so proud.
Bragging is a common behavior that we see on the part of serial killers, in particular sadistic serial killers. And in particular, when you have a group of them together, they're proud of what they do.
A witness overheard their boasting and reported to police. When questioned, 2 of the nurses confessed.
This was very interesting with these 2 ladies, Wagner and Gruber. It was like falling stones from their shoulders or their body. They wanted to speak.
Police and hospital administrators could scarcely believe the magnitude of the murders.
At first, nobody wanted to accept that the problem could be so large, that the police had to investigate more than 300 cases.
Exhumations and postmortems were difficult. Evidence of drowning often lost to decomposition. But enough was collected to prove 38 cases of homicide, with many other cases indeterminable.
This was extreme. In America and in some other continents, we had such cases that nurses killed somebody, but I think this was one of the largest cases worldwide. And this was a shock around the world, what really happened here in Vienna.
And just as rare, 4 angels of death working together.
There have been cases of murder in hospital before concerning hospital personnel, but only in this case there were 4 people knowing each other.
Nurses Waltraud Wagner and Irina Leidolf were convicted of multiple murders. They served life sentences. The other 2 were convicted of manslaughter and attempted murder and sentenced for 15 years. In small-town Australia, Katherine Knight was brewing her own personal storm. Her target, fiancé John Price. Katherine's ex-husband, David Kellett, knew John was playing a dangerous game.
John Price was a good bloke. I'd only met him the once, but I found him to be very sincere and very scared. I believe he broke off the engagement, and I believe Kathy couldn't stand to be left alone again.
Katherine's borderline personality disorder had proven too much. John asked her to leave, as he had done several times before. But this would be the last. Katherine would end their arguments forever.
The video that Katherine made the day she killed John Price is much like the other videos in her collection. She drove to her daughter's place to film the grandchild, and there's some beautiful footage of Katherine playing with this little baby on the ground. And then there's a moment when Katherine addresses the camera and says, "I love my grandchildren. I hope I will see you all again." And it's as if she's making a last will and testament. This was a signal, a definite signal that she was going to kill John that night and that her life was not going to be the same the next morning.
On the morning of March 1st, 2000, Detective Sergeant Bob Wells was called to John Price's address.
It's still something that has a great effect on me today. It's something I'm still trying to come to grips with even today, emotionally and mentally.
Katherine's fury created a crime scene unlike any in Australian history.
I think upon walking into that particular crime scene, it was horrific carnage that was throughout that house from one end to the other. Had almost anybody who went into the house that day in sort of a feeling of numbness for quite some time before they came to actually register what had actually happened, you know.
Katherine had been to work with her knives.
He was stabbed approximately 37 times, about the body. Information from the forensic people were that one of those blows was a fatal blow to the heart, which eventually was the cause of death.
One well-placed stab is all that's necessary to kill someone. 37 indicates to me a lot of anger, and probably a number of those stab wounds were post-mortem. Just couldn't stop killing him.
But Katherine's revenge would go further, much further.
The murder was ritualistic. Katherine went out that day, she prepared for it. She went to the welfare shop and she bought a black nightie, a sexy black nightie with buttons down the front. She went to his house late.
While visiting her estranged partner, Katherine stabbed him 37 times. She did not stop there.
And at some stage, something clicked in Katherine's mind. She'd had her initial revenge, and then I think she decided she wanted to have some fun. She went back to the life she loved, to cutting up animals and carcasses and that sort of business.
Katherine had been cooking, as she had almost every day, preparing an evening meal of meat and vegetables. When police arrived at the crime scene, they found a pot still warm on the stove and 2 meals waiting on the table. In horror, Detective Sergeant Bob Wells realized that the meal was made from her former partner, John Price.
I really think at the time it was hard for me to say, well, how could any human do that to any other human?
I cried for days. in bed, out of bed, walking around, just to think what she'd done.
Katherine was found asleep in bed. She'd unsuccessfully tried to overdose on prescription drugs. The storm had passed.
This is dreadful, gruesome, horrible behavior that we rarely see. We see it, but it's not very common.
These deadly women were united by a vortex of revenge. But its source is as varied as their crimes. Blanche Taylor Moore.
Her father was a gambler and a womanizer, and he so totally abandoned them that they never even heard from him again.
This woman was abused, abandoned, neglected by the most important man in her life, a father.
She had relationships with men that were doomed from the beginning. She chose men with whom she could not form a stable relationship.
And when it happened again, she just absolutely could not help herself, and it was an urge that she chose to give into.
Ruth Ellis.
10 days before she shot him, she had a miscarriage. Maybe, just perhaps, the lady's mind is not going to be 100%.
Getting away with it, that wasn't as important to her as, I'll show you, watch this, you can't do this to me. Taking his life far exceeded the need to get away with it.
The Austrian nurses.
The starting point was this terrible working situation. But then they became like sisters of death. More and more they felt this power over life and death.
Serial killers have told us that although their first killing wasn't something that they equated with power, that oftentimes into their 4th and 14th and 50th killing, that the motivation was to let the person keep their life or to take their life from them. A God trip, if you will, playing God over someone's life.
And Katherine Knight.
Her father had a stick above a hallway. It was called the killing stick. And he would flog his children, to absolutely flog them on the head, the arms, body, wouldn't matter where, and just totally just flog them.
I think it was a built-up anger over years of failed relationships, and got to the point where she just couldn't go on any longer, and the fact that she might face rejection by another partner again drove her to the point of where she just lost control.
Just because she was a butcher doesn't mean she decided to do these horrible things. She became a butcher because she had an interest in cutting, slicing, and doing those kinds of things. My guess is she had feelings and thoughts and desires to do those kinds of things, the things she did to him post-mortem when she was a young girl.
The court found Katherine to be of sound mind when she butchered John Price. She serves a life sentence.